In 1939, a university researcher took 22 orphans children with no parents, no advocates, no one to say no on their behalf, and set out to deliberately damage their speech, not by accident, not as a side effect of some other treatment, on purpose. He believed stuttering was not something a child was born with. He believed it was something you could plant inside a healthy child like a seed just by telling them, again and again, that something was wrong with the way they talked. So his research assistant sat healthy, normally speaking orphans down in a small room and told them their speech was broken, that they were beginning to stutter, that they needed to stop talking until they could do it right. Some of those children never spoke the same way again. One of them ran away from the orphanage 2 years later and never fully explained why. They called it, even at the time, among the researchers who ran it, the monster study. And the children did not find out what had actually been done to them for 62 years. To understand why this happened, you need to understand Wendell Johnson. Johnson grew up in a small town in Kansas, and Johnson stuttered badly, painfully, in a way that shaped his entire childhood. He described being unable to say his own name in class. He described the specific, singular humiliation of watching other children wait for him to finish a sentence. By the 1920s, he had made his way to the University of Iowa, then quickly becoming the leading American center for the scientific study of speech disorders. And Johnson had a theory that he needed, more than almost any researcher needs a theory, to be true. He believed stuttering was not a physical condition, not something wrong with the vocal cords, the brain, the nerves. He believed it was planted by well-meaning but careless adults who reacted with concern the first time a normal, disfluent toddler repeated a word. He called it the diagnosogenic theory. Stuttering, he argued, begins not in the child's mouth, but in the parent's ear. If Johnson was right, it meant his own stuttering was not a life sentence handed to him by his body. It meant somewhere, someone had simply reacted wrong. It is a theory a hurting child grows into a desperate need to prove. And in 1939, Johnson found the perfect subjects to prove it on. Children nobody was watching closely enough to stop him. The Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home sat in Davenport, Iowa, a state institution housing children whose parents had died, disappeared, or been declared unfit. These were not children with families advocating for them. These were children the state itself was already responsible for. Wards, case numbers. Johnson assigned the physical work of the experiment to his graduate student, Mary Tudor, a young woman in her 20s working toward her master's thesis. Tudor selected 22 children. 10 of them already stuttered. 12 did not completely normal, fluent speakers, ages 5 to 15. The 12 fluent children were split again. 6 were placed in what the study called Group IIB, praised for their speech, told they spoke wonderfully, given warmth and encouragement. The other 6 were placed in Group IA. These were healthy children, children with no speech problem whatsoever. And Mary Tudor's job was to convince them they were becoming stutterers. She sat with each child individually. She told them their speech was bad, that other people had noticed, that they showed all the symptoms of someone who was beginning to develop a serious problem. She told them, and this line survives in the original research notes, word for word, don't ever speak unless you can do it right. Think about what that sentence does to a normally speaking child. Not try to speak more clearly. Don't speak unless you can do it right. For a child who has never once worried about how they talk, that sentence does not correct anything. It creates fear where there was none. The sessions ran for months, from January to August of 1939. And Mary Tudor's own case notes the ones she kept at the time, before any lawsuit, before any public scrutiny, written only for her own research file, describe what was happening to these children in real time. One child began covering her eyes with her hand during sessions and would not look up. Another became so self-conscious that she stopped speaking almost entirely in front of other people. Her schoolwork declined. Her teachers noted she had grown withdrawn. A 12-year-old girl named Mary Korlaski grew increasingly fractious and secretive. When Tudor asked whether her best friend knew about her stuttering, the girl muttered no. Tudor asked why not. The girl shuffled her feet and said, I hardly ever talk to her anymore. 2 years after the study ended, Mary Korlaski ran away from the orphanage. Even Mary Tudor herself, the 20-something graduate student administering all of this, could not fully separate herself from what she was doing. In a letter to Johnson dated April 1940, nearly a year after the sessions ended, she wrote that she believed the children would eventually recover, but that, And these are her own words. We certainly made a definite impression on them. She went back to the orphanage 3 separate times after the official study concluded, on her own time, unpaid, to check on the children. Nobody had asked her to do that. Something in her would not let it go. The study was never published. Johnson's own colleagues, the people who worked alongside him at the University of Iowa, reportedly recoiled at what he had done. It was Johnson's peers, not outside critics, who first started calling it, quietly, among themselves, the monster study. And then, for 62 years, almost nobody outside that building spoke of it again. For 6 decades, the orphans of the monster study grew up not knowing they had been part of an experiment at all. They simply grew up believing something was true about themselves. One woman later identified in court documents as Mary Nixon spent her entire life believing she had a genuine speech problem. She described a lifetime of insecurity built around her voice. She avoided speaking in groups. She second-guessed every sentence before she said it out loud. She was never a stutterer. She had been a completely normal, fluent 5-year-old girl when a graduate student sat her down and told her something was wrong with the way she talked. She carried that lie inside her like it was her own reflection for the rest of her life. In 2001, an investigative reporter named Jim Dyer, working for the San Jose Mercury News, tracked down Mary Tudor, by then 84 years old, living quietly in California, and asked her, on the record, about a thesis she had completed 62 years earlier. Tudor talked. She was, by all accounts, haunted by it still. The article ran, and for the first time, the surviving orphans of the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home, now elderly, some in their 70s and 80s, learned that the insecurity, the self-consciousness, the decades of quietly believing something was broken in them, had a name. It was not a speech problem. It was research. They had been the subjects, and nobody had ever told them. In 2003, Mary Nixon and several other surviving orphans sued the state of Iowa. The state tried to have the case dismissed, arguing decades had passed, that the researchers involved were dead, that the claims could not be fairly litigated after so much time. In 2005, the Iowa Supreme Court disagreed and allowed the case to proceed. In 2007, the state of Iowa settled. 6 plaintiffs, 3 surviving orphans, and the estates of 3 who had already died were awarded a combined $925,000. The state admitted no wrongdoing in the settlement itself, and here is where the story stops being simple, because not everyone agrees Wendell Johnson was a villain. Defenders of Johnson, including respected figures within the field of speech pathology today, argue something specific and worth taking seriously. None of the 6 children in Group IIA actually developed clinical stuttering. Johnson's theory was not proven. The experiment, by its own stated goal, failed. They argue Johnson never intended cruelty, that he was a man who had suffered his entire childhood because of his own stutter, genuinely searching for a cure. Working within the ethical norms of a period in scientific history where informed consent for children barely existed as a concept anywhere in American research. Jane Fraser, president of the Stuttering Foundation, said publicly at the time of the lawsuit that while today nobody would accept using orphans this way, it is important to keep the study in historical perspective. But the orphans themselves never spoke about historical perspective. Hazel Potter Dornbush, one of the plaintiffs, described it in her own words, in her own language, without any softening. I call that brainwashing. She was a child in a state orphanage with nobody to advocate for her. She had, in her own words, nobody to lean on to help her out. Whatever Johnson intended, and intention matters, and I am not going to pretend it does not. The children in that room did not experience intention. They experienced being told, over and over, by an adult they had no power to refuse, that something was wrong with them. That did not require malice to cause lifelong harm. It only required power, and the absence of anyone to say no. Wendell Johnson died in 1965. He never publicly acknowledged what had been done in that study, and he never had to answer for it in his own lifetime. The University of Iowa's Speech and Hearing Clinic still carries his name today. His theory about the diagnosogenic origins of stuttering has since been substantially challenged by modern genetic and neurological research. The field has largely moved past the idea that stuttering can simply be talked into existence in a healthy child. which means the specific harm inflicted on those 6 children in Group IIA was done in service of a theory that turned out, in large part, to be wrong. Here is the detail I cannot get past. Mary Tudor went back to that orphanage 3 times, on her own, after the study had officially ended. Nobody made her. She was not being graded on it. She simply could not leave what she had done alone. If the 20-something graduate student administering the harm felt compelled to return and check on children she was never obligated to check on again, some part of her already knew. In 1940, what this channel spent decades confirming in 2001, she knew before anyone made her answer for it. And she went back anyway, quietly, without being asked, because some part of a person that isn't covered by informed consent forms or institutional review boards still recognizes when a child has been wronged. The system did not have that part. It took 62 years and a newspaper reporter to give these orphans back their own story. This has been Hollow Cure. You just watched a scientist use the children nobody was watching to test a theory that turned out to be mostly wrong. If that thought stays with you, if you find yourself picking a side in that courtroom in your head right now, subscribe because we are not done.